start that up. All right. So am I the only person who has slides right now? Did anybody else have any opening remarks that they wanted to make with slides? Okay, cool. So I just threw together a couple of slides to sort of justify, not really justify, I don't have to justify anything to anybody, but to sort of explain why we're having this afternoon session. And so if you were here in the last session, we talked quite a bit about active learning, and particularly that active learning is something that can enhance student learning. It can help reduce performance gaps among different students. It can reduce failure rates in courses. And it's very well aligned with sort of national priorities from the AAAS, from the HHMI, and other organizations about educational practices in the US. And in this afternoon panel, one of the things that we're going to be talking about is coding to learn and not learning to code, right? So involving code in classes that might not be called, computing for biology majors, bioinformatics, right? So involving code in those classes where you might not necessarily expect to see them, right? And so one of the questions that, sometimes people ask is, well, why not confine coding to your programming for chemistry or programming for biology? One of the things that's dissatisfying about this sort of paradigm is that exposure to computing practices early, exposure to C++, that is a very specific type of computing. Exposure to computer science early on is a predictor of students continuing in that direction, right? And unfortunately, I think a lot of us are familiar with the fact that, oftentimes you can predict who got computing in high school by zip code, right? So when we confine coding to an upper division class that is opt-in, not all students are equally likely to see that. And if we believe that this is an important skill, we need to find ways to bring that to students who might not already know that they need computing, right? And, particularly for some students, their perceptions of classes as technical or mathematical can impact their probability of enrolling in those courses, right? And this is a paper that I read about kind of how students think about courses and how that affects their probability of enrolling. And so when we put that computation in an upper division opt-in course, we filter heavily for students who know that computation is important and they want to opt into that experience and they feel comfortable and confident to opt into that experience. And so what our panelists today are going to tell us a little bit about is how they have involved computing in courses that are not necessarily computing for computer people, right? But that are things like genetics and mammalogy. And we're going to hear quite a bit about that. Right? And so one of the ideas that we're going to kind of explore is, these idea of code to learn. So you're not necessarily learning to code, you're using data analysis to uncover knowledge about your discipline. Right? And that could take a variety of forms. Maybe you analyze some data to uncover, a biological rule. Maybe you look at distributions of organisms on the planet, right? So the idea here is that you are incorporating computation in domain coursework as opposed to separating it out, right? So again, these are some potential activities, data analysis, replicating a published paper, simulation. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and Rachel S., I forgot to put you on here, introduce our panelists. Let me do that really quickly. There, I didn't make a mistake. Got it. There we go. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then let them say a few words about themselves and their work on this topic. And then we'll kind of, take some questions, for our panelists, have some discussion, and then we can break out into smaller rooms for more in-depth and targeted discussions. So I guess, do we just want to introduce ourselves in the order that I have on the screen here? Are we comfortable with that? Okay, so I will turn off my microphone, and if you need to do a slide share or anything like that, let me know and I'll stop my share and you can put yours up.
Okay, mine should be pretty fast. I'm Rachel Wright. I'm an assistant professor at Smith College. That's in Western Massachusetts. No complaints about the weather here. I teach genetics and genomics, and I've done a mix of these strategies, right? If I have a genomics class that is, students know coming in, it's going to be computationally heavy. And I have a sneaky quantitative genetics class where we use a lot of R for simulations. And I tell the students that learning to code is not the objective of the course, but we, of course, by the end of the semester, they can kind of do it. And we've used it to explore some important concepts in quantitative genetics. So I'm excited to hear what other people have been doing and share some of the things I've learned the last couple of years.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Ashley Mayer McDonald. I'm from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. San Luis Obispo is on the coast of California between LA and San Francisco, and is another one of those places that does not have seasons. We have the same weather the whole year. So I am not an evolutionary biologist. I'm not even a biologist. I always try to ward off any thoughts that I'm a biologist by telling you that I don't know how to pipette. Like I always tell biologists that, I'm like, hi, I'm Ashley, I don't know how to pipette, to make sure that they know I have no biologist credibility. But I'm a computational chemist. I'm a physical chemist by training. And I think a lot about how to teach physical and life science students how to code, precisely for, I haven't used the phrase code to learn, but precisely for that reason. It's always really important to ground your programming lessons in solving discipline-specific problems. And even though I'm not that closely related to probably some of your disciplines, I've really done a lot with thinking about the best ways to teach students coding and how to introduce coding. And I'm particularly interested in large-scale curricular innovations. So like teaching programming across your entire chemistry curriculum, from general chemistry all the way to physical chemistry, for example. I also work very closely with an organization called the Molecular Sciences Software Institute, which is an NSF-funded institute that aims to improve software education and training in all molecular sciences, which of course includes molecular biology, along with computational chemistry and materials design as well. And through the MOLSI education program, I did a sabbatical with them a couple of years ago, and they offer a lot of free online resources to help you provide your students with foundational programming lessons, so that then you can focus on teaching the discipline-specific topics that you want, and you don't have to focus so much on coding. And April, if it's okay, I can drop the MOLSI education website in the chat if that would be of interest to people.
Yeah, and I actually forgot about this. We have an Etherpad, which is a collaborative note-taking, tool, basically. I'll put that there. And I completely spaced on mentioning this before the start of this session. I put we have a few things in here already from the morning session, and then some citations for things that came up in our first afternoon session. So we can also add that in there for kind of a persistent set of notes even after this is over. I'll probably compile all of this into a blog post that people can then, access permanently. But yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
All right, hi everybody. My name is Teague, and I'm one of April's colleagues in the biology department at Southeastern. So like Rachel, I sneak in coding, particularly into my organismally focused courses like mammalogy, where generally you get students who are really interested in mammals or trying to find something out about biological diversity. And so then we use coding to explore things like scaling across mammals and how does body size impact a variety of different kinds of variables. They learn how to collect data, especially entering data into things like Google Sheets and then pulling data out from the internet, so they can learn a little bit about how the coding environment within their machine doesn't just exist in that sort of domain, and that it can be sort of interactive in lots of different kinds of ways, especially using things like RStudio Cloud, which I found so far has been my favorite way to pull all these people back together into like single sessions and that I can actually work with them on. I also use this in movement ecology. So most of what I do is working on movement ecology and physiology. And that is a very code heavy course, because I really feel like you can't understand movement of animals unless you actually understand how they move. And so we really break down the data and how it's collected and how we actually can analyze those kinds of things.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Weigel. I'm at the Georgia Institute of Technology. It's in Atlanta, Georgia. We have a huge computing school, so we tend to have lots of folks who are intimidated by coding because they're not a CS major, but they went to bio because they were smart and they just didn't want to have to deal with any kind of coding. So I sneakily put it in there. So I teach ecology and ecology lab and animal behavior, and in all of those courses, I sneak in coding, and then basically by the end of it, they're solving problems they can't do in Excel, which is my main goal, especially for freshmen. So that's generally my jazz. And I'll share in a bit a few different things, but I can really pump right now the Cubes Hub for resources that folks will want to grab. So we'll put those in there in a bit.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Schwartz. I'm at the University of Rhode Island. So I actually want to take I have a bunch of notes that I kind of want to share. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So first off, I wanted to say it's worth thinking about. So April and I have talked a lot about coding to learn and learning to code and all this kind of stuff. And I did this really cool workshop this summer that was all about writing across the curriculum. And so I thought that the analogy was really good. So it got brought up at the very beginning, like, why isn't there just a learn to write class? And there kind of is a learn to write class at most universities, but I think we're all pretty aware that sending students off to the writing department or the English department as learn to write is not exactly what we're going for usually. So I think the same applies here when you're thinking about, do you just send students to take a writing class or a coding class versus do you integrate writing or coding across the curriculum? And how does, you know, if you think about, like, we want students to write minute papers, we want them to write research papers, and how do we teach them to do all that stuff? I think the same thing is true about coding, right? You start sort of small and you integrate it into your classes, and most of your classes aren't about writing or about coding, but you sort of sneak it in, as people have said. So that was the first point that I wanted to bring up. And the second thing is that we do scaffold writing across the curriculum. You don't expect freshmen to come in and write a research paper. You kind of start them off small. And so if we're thinking about getting students to code, you want to get them to learn to code as they sort of move their way across the curriculum, which is something that Ashley brought up. And I think that that's a really good point. So just like writing across the curriculum, or writing in general, we use that, as April brought up, as sort of these minute papers or any sort of paper where the idea is to get students to synthesize. And I am optimistic that getting students to write code and forcing them to think in that way, even if they don't necessarily like it, helps them to start to synthesize information in a way that we don't usually do. And we sort of tell them what they're supposed to learn or tell them stuff. So I've really tried to integrate data analysis, mostly in R, throughout the curriculum. For URI, this starts in intro bio. This was an interesting experience for me as I walked in the door, and I had a very enthusiastic lab instructor who was actually at the 2019 meeting, and she's like, yeah, let's do it. Let's get we're going to do all our data analysis in intro bio in all of our like 26 labs with our grad students. They're all going to be using R. And yeah, don't try and do this your first year that you show up at a university. One of my colleagues came to my office and was like, we're doing this over my dead body. And I was like, oh God, I'm never going to get tenure. So yeah, there's some things to think about. I think she's come around since then. And so we have done this. So our students use R for all of their lab data analysis. I see them later on, and I would say the ones that I see in classes where we don't do any coding are pretty much like, why did we do that? I hate R. I never want to do that again. It was totally pointless. So there's sort of mixed reactions here. But really my goal is to think about this in terms of scaffolding, where, you know, for those of you that are sneaking it in, you know, you're sneaking in, they don't have any basis for R, right? So they maybe take mammology or they take some other class, and you kind of have to start from scratch every time. Anybody's gonna have to start from scratch. So we haven't done this at URI, but in theory, ideally, you get students to learn R as they go through the curriculum. So when you see them as seniors, you can actually get to more advanced data analysis, and you're not like, here's how to load your data with Read CSV, because you just don't want to do that every time. So ideally that works. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but that's kind of my ideal world. And then they could do, somebody just mentioned this about doing data analysis that gets beyond what we can do with Excel. So they may be doing things in iEvoBio that are maybe easier in Excel, but they are hopefully learning skills where when they get more advanced in the curriculum, they are doing stuff that is not as pretty in Excel or not as doable in Excel. So that would be where I'd like them to go. These are also marketable skills. So hopefully at some point when they get out, they're like, I want this job. And they're like, yeah, I can work in R. And, you know, there's a lot to be said for that. So in doing this, we being sort of the grad students and me in my classes, I started off using a live coding approach that software carpentry does. And actually, I have done this. I write out everything in the same way that software carpentry does, so that students can go back and read all of that code and look at the instructions. And it makes it a whole lot easier for me because I'm not winging it. I have everything. So we do some live coding. This year, I actually flipped that. So even though live coding is very active in class, I actually recorded everything. And that was a really nice bit of, I don't know if you want to call it equality or equity, but it was really nice for me because I had students say they went back and watched the videos multiple times. And I always struggle in class with live coding because if you've ever taught with live coding, you have students that are like, okay, totally got this, let's move on. And you have students that are staring at you like they're just lost and they tell you they're lost. And that's a really uncomfortable experience for me as a teacher. That's why software carpentry has helpers in class. I don't have helpers in class. So doing this where I recorded the lessons and then we did other things in class made it even more active. So, and then the students could go back and either read the resources or listen. So iEvoBio is going okay. I think we've got it pretty well set up. The grad students are doing pretty well with it. The undergrads are tolerating it, I guess. So now I've been trying to move this into my sort of mid-level courses. I have a sort of companion course to ecology where we do, as April mentioned, reanalyze data from papers. A lot of these are drawn from TIEE, which is really a great resource. So I've taken what they've done and rewritten it in R. And I usually do this, so I will have them, you know, I'll show them once, here's how you load a library, here's how you load your data. And the next time around, there's just a set of instructions that says, load the library. And now we're moving on. And so it really reinforces that if you don't remember, go back and remind yourself. And if the students that do this, the students that don't kind of skip ahead and just see how I did it, either in class or in the recording, have a much better time with the final exam. They do tend to remember it. The ones that skip ahead don't, but that's, you know, however they're interacting with that content. So again, trying to build those skills, trying to do more than what Excel can do and trying to set them up for future courses. And then I've always taught sort of this upper level class that is coding for scientists, I guess you can say. And so that sort of comes about to like, are we teaching coding? Is the goal coding or is the goal learning fundamental ecological concepts where they do some data analysis and then they see the result and they understand an ecological question, and in the process you've sneaked in some coding. So in my upper level course, I do it, the goal is for doing coding, right? That's, you know, sort of the graduate student basic skill. So I have some of that as well. And I'm currently working on a Cure course where it's all genomic data. So of course they're going to be coding, because there's no other way to interact with your genomic data other than on the cluster, because it doesn't fit anywhere else. So that's kind of the whole variety of things that I do and teach, all the way from the bottom to the top, I think. And it sort of brings me around to this like coding to learn versus learning to code. I think that writing across the curriculum is a really good example, and there's a lot of data on how writing reinforces learning and can really help students learn, digest content, synthesize ideas, come up with new ideas, you know, learn to support their ideas with arguments. So there's all this literature on that, really pretty well accepted. And I haven't really seen any literature on using coding to learn. And I sort of hope that by asking them to say, okay, now I've got to load my data and I've got to think about what this graph looks like, and I've got to plot this thing, and I've got to figure out, you know, I've got to write down X and Y. I kind of hope that that is a way for them to reinforce their learning a bit. And I don't know if that's true, and I haven't seen any literature on it. Maybe somebody else has. But yeah, that's what I'm hoping for.
Awesome. So I guess we'll do what worked in the morning panel, which was we had people put questions in the chat, and I'm just going to be here to act as a facilitator. Sorry, it's already been a little bit of a long day for me. And that worked really well in the morning panel. So if you have a question, certainly if you feel comfortable to raise your hand and ask it verbally, you are welcome to do that. If you would prefer to write your question down, I will, you know, repeat those to the panel and have them, you know, have at it. So go ahead, attendees, you can go ahead and put questions into the chat. We had come up with a few kind of seed questions for while everyone is still sort of thinking and digesting about what they've heard. And I think I will throw one out there. I think Rachel Wright came up with this one, which is, how do you design activities for students who might have different levels of experience or different levels of practice with coding?
I could take this one. One thing that I do is I flip all of the coding. So I have the students do the majority of the coding that they're doing at home at their own pace, and then they have to apply what they were doing at home to a new problem in class. So they can work at their own pace at home as much as they want to over a week's period or something like that, with scattered times that they can kind of reach out to their TAs to actually, you know, work through stuff if they get stuck and that kind of thing. But generally the week works out. I have a weird challenge where I don't actually get to teach my coding. I have to teach my TAs, who then immediately go teach the students, and usually they're at the same place where the students are, which is very awkward. So it helped me out a lot to basically create activities that the students could work at their own pace on at home, and then they have a novel activity in class. And if I have an activity that's designed correctly for the level that they're at, when they get to the application level, they all have the sufficient background to be able to go forward. So that's one way that I solve it, is by putting sort of the nuts and bolts, the part where they would be misstepping or at different pacing before they actually arrive at class. And then when they get to class, they have the application of that.
Awesome. And you sort of brought up an interesting point there, which is teaching assistants, because I think not everyone has them, first of all. And then there's kind of a follow-along question from Elizabeth Fryer. For faculty who don't know how to code themselves, how do we get them to incorporate some coding in classes? And that kind of goes along with training your teaching assistants, right? How far ahead of your students do you have to be? Is this like the piano teacher learning the next piece of music right before classes? And how far ahead do you think your TAs have to be? Like, how do you kind of develop a workforce, I guess, to help you with these courses, or do you?
So there's a couple things I can say about faculty who don't know how to code. How do we get them to incorporate some coding? The MOLSI is working on this issue a lot. We have an instructor training where we teach faculty how to code so that they can teach their students how to code. We do that every summer. It was in person in 2019, but it's been Zoom ever since then. So one obvious suggestion is you can offer people training. I just edited a book called Teaching Programming Across the Chemistry Curriculum. And the first chapter in that book, I invited someone who is not a trained computational scientist who has started incorporating coding into her classes. It's Grace Stokes from Santa Clara University. And she wrote this first person narrative for the book about what supports really helped her, a non-computational person, include more coding in her classes. And the things that were helpful were ready access to resources, the things like Emily was mentioning, having having recordings to go back and look through so that you could watch things multiple times and things like that. Having a pre-made coding assignment. I teach in Python a lot. That's not the only thing I teach in, but I do a lot of Python. So having these pre-made Jupyter notebooks where there's a lot of code filled in, and then you just have to do one more step yourself. That kind of thing is very helpful, both for students and for faculty who don't have a lot of coding experience themselves. And then the other thing that was really helpful for her is she joined a professional learning community through Research Corporation, where she was kind of paired with some people who were more advanced at coding, and they really gave her real-time, regular feedback. And I know that those are all things that she's highlighted as being supports that really helped her, even though she wasn't as far into coding. And yes, she will readily admit that sometimes she felt like she was only a day or two ahead in her coding knowledge from the students, but that was okay. And that the trade-off for thermodynamics not just being this like boring slog because you could do real problems that you can't do on paper was worth it. So.
Okay, Maike, is that how you pronounce your name? Did you have a question or comment?
Yes, exactly. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the interesting discussion so far. So I'm teaching also kind of programming in the context of evolutionary ecological modeling, and we are trying to give students fairly detailed like instructions for how to program in R, these whatever they are trying to do. So it's like programming the students to program the program pretty much. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts on like how detailed to make those, because I'm a bit worried that we give them too much instruction, like, okay, now write a for loop like this, and then write a function like that, and that they are missing out a bit on the struggle that like lots of us have when learning to code, that one has to search for all the information oneself and really think hard about it. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts, or if there's any research, like what would be the best way to learn programming, like how much instruction would be the best, or how much direction and how much struggle there should be.
So I wanted to say one thing is in our classes, we really emphasize that we're not teaching them programming. And we've had some TAs that sort of brought up like, well, we need to teach them to program. And so really try and de-emphasize that. We're doing data analysis. We're using R in this case, which is something that we settled on because it sort of suited our needs best in this particular instance. But we don't really try and think about it as teaching programming. I tell people that, right now we're using R. In the future, maybe we'll use Julia. Who knows? That's not the point. But the point is to do data analysis in a way that's effective. So that probably doesn't answer your question fully, but it was a perspective.
I would say that at least from my students, making things as easy as possible is the best way to get things done. Because there is a lot of hesitancy for people who really don't have a lot of experience or a lot of motivation at the start. So set up things like was presented before, where you have lots of blocks of fill in the blank code, where you can sort of build on their skills and transition them into getting something that's also coded. But also, when I'm live coding with students, I don't usually answer their questions right away. I Google for the answer to the question, because one of the things that I try to teach them is how to actually find the answers that you don't know, because that's like, what I spend most of my time doing is, trying to find help for the same problem that I just haven't committed to memory over and over and over again.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I really emphasize at the start a couple of things about coding that I think are unique, at least that I felt personally. And everyone talks about the steep learning curve, right? You hit a lot of roadblocks, you can't get past them. And also I've witnessed like this level of frustration that I don't witness in other classes that I teach, right? Students could be absolutely demoralized by a cryptic error message in a way that they are not demoralized if I tell them, they guessed the gene wrong or something. So we have a big upfront intervention about that. And I do the same thing that Teague says, as I do the Googling of what function do I use to find the average, right? Just kind of demonstrating all of those things. And also emphasizing that there's not one correct way to do everything. In coding, there are multiple right ways. So you have some flexibility, and other people have said scaffolding, right? So I can say, hey, here's how I made a vector of the number 1 through 10. Now you Google and find a new way to make a vector of numbers 1 through 10.
Just want to add to that. I think there is an importance to show them that there's a creative side of this, but like it's sort of balancing the initial like try to do it this way, and then you keep going. There's some good work on sub-goal labeling. So if you label specifically the step the same way every time, it doesn't matter the actual coding that goes into it. If they start to understand the logic of what they're doing, like this step gets my data in, this step checks my data, this step reformats my data, that kind of thing. It doesn't matter exactly what their code says, but they start to understand how to think in that way and how to manipulate. That can be really helpful. And another thing is sometimes take it completely out of the coding context and go, okay, if you were to do this in Excel, your favorite tool, how would you do this? What steps do you need to think through before you even touch the computer? Because sometimes where they're stuck isn't actually the coding, but it's the thinking about the data analysis. And so it's independent of that tool. And so sometimes even I've done puzzles before where I will give them all the code and I'm like, put it in order, put it in the logical order that this needs to go, and just rearrange it on a table. Like do that. Sometimes that can really help to see exactly what details you need to have with certain folks. And I know this is really antsy and weird, but sometimes I'll time the students to see where they are with a similar task across the semester to know, can I pull out some of those additional details and just kind of push them a little bit? Or do I really need to slow down because they're getting stuck at the same step every time? So sometimes it helps to think about the logic and making sure the logic is there before putting in those details, and then see how much detail you need to put in there, keeping in mind the consistency of those labels.
So Emily, that's just such a great point, because I think getting students to write out the pseudocode before they actually write the code is a really good strategy. And I have had exactly what Emily had, where the students are like, well, I tried this code, and it's like they just sort of throw code at the problem. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work. So think about each step. And this is where like I'm really interested in code to learn, because you do have to break it down into these tiny little steps for the computer. Like I need to do this step. I need to load the data. I need to then, make a graph with this X and this Y, and I want to separate out the data in this way. And so that to me is really interesting. But having them, I need to definitely do more of this. It's a very in-class kind of activity, to have them sit down and write out the steps of their data analysis as pseudocode, or just really break it down like that is a good in-class thing to do, and then layer the code back in.
It's shockingly helpful to them to draw analogies between data structures and things they do in Excel. Like if they think about, they write a formula in Excel and then they click and they drag it down so it does it for all the cells. Well, that's like doing a for loop, because we're going to do it for everything in this list. Like I sort of hate Excel, and I try to like it pains me to like draw analogies to Excel and sound like Excel is a great thing. But the fact that they can all relate to it, like that really actually does help them a lot.
Okay, I'm gonna be that mouthy person, and I have to share this. On the first day of class, when I'm like, please, like, actually start to learn coding. Don't just do this in Excel. I give them a task that takes approximately 6.5 hours in Excel, or if they type in 3 lines of code in R, takes about a few seconds, right? So that's all they have to do, right? And so I'll give them an option of which one they want to do. And so this is a 3-hour-long lab. A few of the kids will go ahead and do it, and they'll be gone, and they'll go. And the other kids will sit there and continue to do this in Excel for hours. And I'm like, they're gone. Why do you think it might be good to kind of learn this? And it eventually, like, using that time gets buy-in completely, because I'm like, this will save your life. Like, well, not in time wise, right? Like, there's hardly any tasks with like trains and whatnot, but like there's going to be a way that this will work. So I think to Ashley's point of hating to sort of bring up Excel, I almost use it as an anti-example, which was very helpful in COVID times, pointing out like Excel files actually hurt the UK's ability to monitor what was going on with COVID. And I would kind of bring up like, Excel is not the perfect tool that you think it is. So maybe we should look at CSVs and bigger data sets.
Yeah, we kind of do that too, where we give them like a small example data set, and then we're like, okay, apply this to this really big data set. And it's not, it's too big to work with in Excel. You can't scroll through 20,000 lines and copy paste things. It's just a nuisance. And so it's a chance for them to see that, yeah, you can do things in R that just work better. It's a little more motivation.
Yeah, not to like jump on this hate Excel train too much, but it is something that another thing that I think students have found motivating for me, that I emphasize, and I think other faculty have found this motivating as well, is that when you analyze data computationally, you are being a more responsible researcher, right? We have trackable code, right? So we give an example where there's an Excel file and there are 7 columns of data, and you have no idea kind of the number of steps that went into manipulating those data. But then when you have nicely labeled code, it's completely reproducible. All of your steps are documented. I think students in, kind of an RCR mindset have found that really compelling. And if I'm talking, I can also address Gregor's question that just came up in the chat about the pencil and paper problem solving with coding on the computer. I have some examples here. This kind of goes back to the pseudocode that some people have talked about, of like getting your students to think through the analytical steps of coding. I've done a lot of that. I've done everything from, on the first day of a coding class, I've had them, I'm the computer and they have to code me to make a paper airplane, right? And so it's everything from telling me to get up out of my chair and walk across the room. And so we kind of tackle some of those frustrations and the level of detail that you need to be able to code. This is at like a really intro level. Also doing things like make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I know that one's really popular. Other ones we've done are with data wrangling type tasks, where I will literally print out tables of information and give them a pair of scissors and say, like, you want to transform this matrix, or you want to remove a row, or things like that. Just getting them to think, to use their hands and say, we're going to start thinking about things before I put you in front of a computer, because I know the instant some of these students get in front of a computer is when they like shut down. So I try to leave the computer out for like a day if I can.
Gregor, one thing that I really like to do is, so one of the things that I emphasize, and again, this isn't a physical chemistry class, this may not be a totally relevant example, but I like to emphasize that you can solve problems with coding that you can't solve with pencil and paper. And that also sometimes it makes it a lot easier. So a good example in physical chemistry is, does anybody remember how you derive the integrated rate law for first order and 2 reactants? I'll tell you, it's the method of integration by partial fractions. I don't know when the last time you integrated by the method of partial fractions, but I'm not good at it, and I did know how to do it at one time. So I sort of make them start, like I make them start trying to integrate this rate law with the integration by partial fractions. And I let them work on it for about 7 or 8 minutes, or until someone starts whining. And then I'm like, well, let's think about what we really need to know here. Do we really need an equation that tells us what the concentration is at a later time, given the concentration at this beginning time? Do we really need the equation, or do we just care about what the concentration is at the later time? Okay, we just care about the concentration at the later time. And then we can talk about a numerical solution and implementing a numerical solution. And I think that that type of problem, where it's something that you can do with pencil and paper, but it's hard, versus solving it numerically, that has a lot of value to a lot of them. And it really motivates a lot of them to learn to do it numerically. And then you can move on to things like, that are not first order into reactants, and do more complicated type kinetics problems. So I think trying to think of something like that, where you can do it on paper, but it's hard. Doing it numerically is better, and then doing it numerically would let you solve even more real world problems. That's the kind of thing that I like to pair for one of those pencil and paper and coding examples.
So there have been a couple of questions that are all sort of related that have popped up in the chat about language choice. And even in some of these cases, sublanguage, R and tidyverse versus base R. So how do you make your decisions about, tools, basically, right? Because the language is just a tool for the concept that you want to teach. So how do you make those choices about tools?
So if you're trying to do a large scale curricular innovation and you're trying to make these changes in multiple classes, we found that it was very important to get everybody to agree to the same tool. Previously, we were doing kind of like, oh, here's a one-off lab where we used Mathematica, and here's a one-off lab where we used MATLAB. And the students never learned how to use the tools effectively. So I simultaneously believe that what tool you choose is not important, and that it is important that you choose one tool, particularly if you are going for one of these larger scale curricular things. I wrote this in a comment earlier. If there's any tool that you can build consensus around, that's the one to choose. And particularly find the most hesitant people and see which tool they want to use and use that one. Because if I'm fine with MATLAB or Python or C++, and somebody else, is really uncomfortable with anything except MATLAB, then go with MATLAB, even if that's not your personal preference. So those would be, so I simultaneously believe that the tool doesn't matter, but that you should pick just one, and that you should try to accommodate the person who is most uncomfortable with the tool choice. And I also acknowledge that this could be very discipline specific. If you're into genomics and bioinformatics today, then you're using R. Whereas if you're into more molecular things like quantum chemistry type calculations, then you're probably using Python. Like, those discipline specific differences exist.
I put it in the chat, but I think this is something to kind of harp on a little bit. Like, sometimes you'll have people that are hesitant because their materials already exist, and you'll have sometimes people are hesitant because they just don't know that other language. I've had some success with folks that are hesitant in both of these ways by just asking for their materials that are currently written in like Python or Excel and just converting it. It doesn't really actually take me that long, but when I know that the students spent an entire semester then learning the basics, it makes my life easier. So it's like a small investment to actually have the students be exposed to that. And then through the semester of teaching with this new thing, some of my more hesitant colleagues have gone, oh, it's not as bad as I thought. And I'm like, really? You're having the same transformation as students? Good. And then they start to build these things in. So sometimes it can be worth it to get folks in the classes, especially before your class. Because I can't echo enough Ashley's comment about having folks like at least somewhat in the same neighborhood of languages. It really does help the students to not like to realize that there are some principles behind communication that are independent of language. That can really help. It's especially good if the folks coming into your class have already seen some of this stuff before.
Yeah, we kind of settled on R for the reason that it was something that sort of works across biology, is pretty common. Of the grad students, I'd say more of them have seen R than have seen Python. Some of them have seen both, some of them have just seen Python. But and we try and run a boot camp in the fall to get at least all the intro bio TAs on board. To my mind, and if you look at sort of what resources are out there, R does data analysis really well. It does some other things not so well. Python is a fantastic programming language, but it feels more like a programming language. So since our goal was never to teach students how to program, it's, you know, starting an intro, like let's make a graph, let's make summary tables. Python is not really ideal if that's where you're starting. So it really depends on, I think like other people have said, what you're trying to do. But yeah, we settled on R as being something that is semi-data analysis friendly for across biology.
So here's a question. How many of you have other folks in your department who are teaching something computational? And, you know, what are they teaching? Is it before you, after you? Do you have an idea of where you're going to be picking up from those colleagues? Or is it sort of a, you know, depends on who's teaching what that semester? Maybe your students have never seen R before, maybe they're quite good at it.
So because we're such a large school, like we're a 24,000 person campus, all of our classes are coordinated classes. There's a course coordinator for PChem, there's a course coordinator for biochem, et cetera, et cetera. So we have these curricular meetings where we make decisions about what we're going to teach. So we can count on that no matter who taught thermodynamics the quarter before, the students learned their programming learning objectives and they learned their thermodynamics learning objectives. So we have that advantage. In terms of like, how did we grow from one class teaching programming to our whole curriculum teaching programming? We started with one class, then we went to one sequence of classes, which in our curriculum was the physical chemistry classes. Then we're like, okay, what's the closest thing? Who's our closest neighbor here in physical chemistry? What's something that we're teaching them in physical chemistry that we could see them using in another class? And we're like, well, data analysis and visualization and doing statistics is a big analytical chemistry thing. So then we went to analytical chemistry. And then I think the next one that we got in was biochemistry. We found a biochemistry faculty member who was very dedicated. So you grow in a way that makes sense in your discipline, I guess would be my suggestion. You know, I don't know who the nearest neighbor to structural biology is, maybe molecular biology, but the nearest, find your nearest neighbor and try to translate your students' coding skills from one class to another class.
I can go. So I'm at a small liberal arts college. And students have a lot of control over their curriculum design. There are lots of ways to navigate through the major. We're also part of a consortium of 5 colleges. Long story short, students can evade any class that they want to evade. They will find a way to get around it. So I'm going to answer what I think the hidden question might have been, which is, what can I assume my students know when they come into my class? And the answer is nothing. And I think that might be true for everyone. So there's something to be said for kind of, I literally have at least a video now that there's been COVID and all of my stuff is on YouTube. I at least ask students to watch this video that's like using R like a calculator, setting your working directory. Some students need it, some students don't. I just literally start there every single time. I make almost no assumptions.
Yeah, so just to respond to what Rachel said, this is where, like I said, some students come in and they know stuff and some don't. And so actually the videos, I thought, you know, switching everything from live coding to video was fantastic because I had students literally tell me they watched the videos 4 times because when they went to do their exams, which are all open book, open note, they're like, how do I generate this summary table to do this thing, right? So they need to go back and do it. And other students I know have a lot more practice and experience, and they don't need to watch the videos 4 times. They probably watched it once on double speed and got the point and figured out those bits. And so, yeah, to my mind, that's been one of the great things about, you know, sort of dealing with COVID actually, was that I am putting stuff online, and it gives the students, if they've never seen code, they start there. If they have seen code, they go as fast as they need. And then, you know, they come into class and we talk about other things and work through other problems that are more common or everybody needs to work on.
Yeah, so you're looking at 2 of the people, the only 2 people who teach computational biology in my department, so both April and I. And so I've been lucky on 2 occasions to have students who have come through April's courses or worked in her lab. So I have to start from the ground up. It would be really nice if we could transition across the faculty to bring in more computational approaches to biology, but I think it's going to, for us, it's going to be a long process to see if that's what we're actually going to get to.
I guess I'm on the other end of this, where I teach, like, folks can AP into my class in their first semester, and their first semester freshmen taking the class, which is interesting. But they're go-getters, and they make it work. I think it's also good if you are early on in the curriculum to talk to the people later that potentially want to integrate things in, and tell them what you're doing and what skills the students should leave with, so that they know where they're roughly able to start. I mean, I think you have to make the assumption they don't know anything when they go class to class, no matter what, especially if they can move through different ways in the curriculum. But if you can start to use that as a united front, I've had some success in recent years, but I'm going to be honest, it's taken a while, even at a place that has lots of folks that are doing computational stuff, to get more people to actually put it in beyond just run this code, you code it. Like, it's more than that, and trying to get them to think that way, it's taken a little bit, but like, keep your momentum up, and it will work, and the students will come back. Like, I'm at the point now where I've been here 5 years, and I'm starting to have students coming back. They're going to grad school in these things. Our numbers are going up. The lab, like, it's so it takes a bit, and there's a delay, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I've definitely had some lag in that. Like, I can't remember how many exactly students I have in my like biological data analysis class this semester, but it's going to be a big one. I actually need to find a different room than the one I normally teach in, which is great. But to your point, Emily, about bringing kind of, you know, if we can get this into the curriculum early, you know, we have panelists here who are at a real variety of different institutions. How do you find that putting this coursework into the curriculum affects your ability to recruit for research?
So that was the whole point, that for me, of getting students in intro bio to do a little bit of R, because I almost never get students who are interested in research with me. And I think a lot of them get scared off by the code, or they think lab work is the thing. And so, you know, getting them to start sort of from ground zero, and also, you know, it's why I'm currently building a Cure class to try and get more students. But I think I don't see them early on. And so just related to what I teach. But so getting students comfortable with code early, and the idea that it's familiar and it's not scary and allows you to do data analysis. Yeah, it means that when they walk in the door for me, they kind of have some clue what they're getting into.
Anyone else on that one? Because otherwise we have a question in the chat. Okay, so this one's from Anya. How much, if at all, do you all chat with people in computer science departments? Why or why not?
So I became aware last summer that I was an infamous person in the computer science department. And starting about 3 summers ago, at the beginning of our summer research program, I teach a 2-day Python crash course about parsing files, sorting data, plotting with matplotlib, doing data analysis with NumPy. It's 6 hours over 2 days. It is not a lot of information. And I had done this for a while, and I was just like, do. Well, it turns out that there was a data science consortium that had faculty from stats and faculty from computer science. And they had been arguing with each other for literally years about what type of training program they should offer in basic programming. And then one day, somehow they found out about my thing, and they were like, and McDonald's just teaching them to code. Like, she's just doing it. Like, she didn't talk to anybody. and, and I'm not really sure whether this was positive or negative. So one thing that's a challenge in talking to computer science departments and interfacing with them is they are teaching coding for a different reason than you're teaching coding. They're teaching coding to fundamentally understand data structures and logic and the theory of how computer software is written. And that's all very important. It is all very important, but that's not why I'm teaching students coding in my classes. And I think from hearing everybody talk today, that's not why people are teaching coding. So that's why it can be hard. That said, now I'm in the data science consortium where I formerly had this, role of infamy. And from this, I've actually met two of our new faculty members who are experts in computer science education and evaluating computer science education. And I'm now doing a project with them where they are evaluating the effectiveness of the programming curriculum within our physical chemistry curriculum, which is incredibly valuable because I don't really know how to assess that. And I can anecdotally say, well, I think students are learning things, and I see students taking things that they learned in PChem and applying them to research questions. And I can give you examples of this, but I don't have any quantitative data about the effectiveness of our curriculum. And by interfacing with these computer scientists who know how to assess how well students learn to program and how well they can apply those skills to other problems, that's been hugely valuable for me. So I have pros and cons to share about the computer scientists. So it's also, and this may be a very specific problem to us, but like there's this class called CPE 101, which is computer programming for engineers, and it's offered in the computer science department. And a lot of the students would like to take that because they fundamentally are interested in computation and they're interested in computing, and it's extremely hard to get into. So sometimes the computer science classes aren't even accessible to our students who would be interested in taking them. And that's probably not a problem at a small liberal arts college, but at other types of institutions, that may also be a problem. So
yeah, that's
Anya,
that's across the country. It's impossible to get into CS classes everywhere. That is, yeah, still true.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answered your question, Anya, and I'm also definitely not a computer science department hater. Like I said, I have these two great new collaborators, but I think that those are some of the challenges.
Yeah, I totally concur. So I have a couple of colleagues in CS who are fantastic. One is married to a biologist, so maybe that kind of like points him in the right direction. A lot of those computer scientists think about things like Ashley mentioned, like data structures and how you work with data structures. And so we had a sort of a whole thing about what a data science program should look like. And I'm pretty sure that I lost, which was I was arguing for data science means you have to know something about your data. And they said data science means that you know how to program with data structures and do statistics, and what kind of data it is totally irrelevant, and you don't have to know any sort of disciplinary work at all. And I was like, well, don't you need to know something about your data? And apparently the answer to that was no. So there's definitely some people in the CS department whose orientation is around, around data structures and databases and all that kind of work. And then there are people who are interested in more biological problems. And so it just depends.
Yeah, so we had a question in the last session that I thought was relevant to this one. I wanted to bring it back around because I promised the individual that I would try and get him an answer by the end of today. So, we think about kind of code to learn as being sort of active. How do you evaluate assignments? Do you have students do peer review, self-review? How do you check code for correctness, or do you check that it did the goal, they accomplished the goal, however they did it? What do you do for evaluation?
For mine, they all get homework assignments that are based on the code that we worked on in class. And so they have to usually build a figure and interpret the figure in some sort of way and answer a bunch of questions about that. And so by looking at their answers to the questions, I can see whether or not they've done it, whether or not they've achieved the goal of what I want them to get out of it. Because otherwise they're not going to, without seeing the correct formats of the figures, they're not going to be able to answer the questions correctly. And so then we can come back to it later on to see what's actually wrong.
One thing that I do a lot is I give them randomized cases. I tell them, okay, you're going to write code to do this. And then we have this online homework system that they submit all their lab reports through already. It's called LabPal. So then I'm like, okay, now log on to LabPal. And then in LabPal, you can give them randomized things like either truly random numbers, or you can choose one thing at random off this list. So then I say, run your code for whatever case LabPal tells you to run it for and put in your answer. And then the computer program can give them immediate feedback on whether they're right or wrong. So they can test whether their code is working correctly. But they can't just copy each other's because they all get a different random case to run from the online system. And then I tell them, okay, now that you know your code is working correctly, do this, this, and this, and then answer these questions for me. And those are usually more application questions, more chemistry questions. What did we learn as the quantum number increased? Did tunneling become more or less likely? How did your data show you that? Something like that. And that sort of reduces my need to look at every line of their code and grade it, which is very hard. But it both assesses if they wrote their code correctly and if they then applied their code correctly to physical chemistry and learned their physical chemistry learning outcomes. So that's one thing that I do. And then sometimes I give them a problem and I say, this is your problem that you need to solve. In your code, you need to demonstrate that you know how to do the following 3 things. And then that's to April's point about, are you checking whether they did it the way you wanted them to do it, or whether they, just solved the problem? So those are 2 strategies that I use. This is also a good time to put in a plug for NB Grader. If you haven't ever used NB Grader, if you are a Python person, or really anything in the Jupyter world, so Julia or any of those things, NB Grader is a core product from the Product Jupyter team that lets you auto-grade students' code submissions in Jupyter Notebook. So if you were looking for more of a tool suggestion and not a philosophical explanation, that is what I would suggest.
So there was a comment earlier. So most of what I do, I think, is similar to what other people have mentioned. Can you take your code and apply it to a new scenario and get the answer? So I think that's totally reasonable. If you think about this at maybe the graduate level, what I ask them to do is say, you're doing research. I've taught you how to analyze your data and share it reproducibly, write a README on Git and have your repo and keep track of everything. So now you need to do that with your own results, your own research work to show that. And then the comment earlier was actually about things like code review, which I think is really interesting because it suggested parallels to me about things like peer review at the undergraduate level with writing. So when you think about, if you've, I don't know how many of you have used Eli Review or heard of Eli Review, but Eli Review is a peer review tool for writing. And one of the things that they emphasize that I think is really interesting, if you give your students, you get them to write something, you share it around, and they give each other comments. And realistically, those comments aren't very good. But the Eli review tool has this whole discussion about how the people doing the learning in the peer review are the people doing the reviewing, not the people getting the reviews back, because the reviews aren't going to be great from students. But the process of doing the review is really interesting. And because the students have to say, oh, does this essay have a thesis? And so the comment above about having students reviewing other students' code, which I've never done, because I think I really don't get to that level, I think is a really interesting point, because I think there would be a lot of learning opportunity for the person doing the review and reading somebody else's code, probably even more than the person getting comments about their code, because I don't know how good those comments are going to be. But you could see, you know, oh, somebody else tackled this problem in this way, right? Or here's how they, you know, did their comments, or here's how they did whatever. I think that could be really, really great. And it's just maybe beyond what I do at this point in teaching students, but I think it could be really cool.
So I've got an activity that has them review that's called Be Reviewer Number 3. I give them data from Dryad or from somewhere else where it's clearly analyzed the wrong way, but analyzed the wrong way in a way that they should know why it's wrong. So like data that is autocorrelated, but they're trying to act like they're independent samples. And so they have to run the code that they get and show like, I get this, but this is why this isn't right. And so they have to kind of give me a little thing about why this is not the analysis to do. And that's step 1. Step 2 is write out what you think should happen. And then there's a challenge question that they get to skip the next homework, which is basically doing the exact same thing again, if they can write out the code for what they should do with that data. And like that's towards the end of my class, but the way I have it structured through most of the classes, each of the labs has a component that they're going to need to do their final project. So if they're labeling things and they keep it all together, then by the end of the class, they need to put all the puzzle pieces together, kind of like the problem solving crows where they've seen all the puzzles before and they just have to link them all together in the right way. Kind of the same idea. And it's really been helpful midway through the semester to give them a subset of data that'll look like what their final project data looks like, and have them write out the code and then send the code in whatever state it's in with whatever amount of commenting it is to another student, and have them look at it and go like, do you even understand what this person is trying to do? Do you think that they're going in the right direction? Like, and it's very kind of like high level, but they can point out problems that students are doing surprisingly well midway through, but it's also sort of a question of practice. They have to see it over and over and over again, but it does kind of work, but they have to be comfortable with it doing it sort of repeatedly all the way through. I don't think it would work if maybe outside the context of like the lab that I'm in, but if they're doing it weekly, it could work. So I'm going to echo Rachel's thing that it could be quite a good spot, especially if you're in a latter class.
Yeah, we do something like that in my biological data analysis class where, you know, kind of the last homework assignment is they get someone else's code and they have to sort of predict what it does, and then be the test audience for the person's final tutorial. Because what I have them do is make a little R package that has, you know, 3 functions or something in it, and with the documentation and all of that sort of thing. And so someone has to predict what the code does and then be the test audience for the tutorial where they're going to take the whole class through what they did. So the question that's sort of going on in the chat now is kind of about technologies and like the assistive supportive technologies that we may or may not be using. So I guess, do we just want to do, you know, everybody tell us, you know, one thing that they've found that's been incredibly helpful for them in teaching, whether that's like GitHub Classroom or that's using GitHub itself or MBGrader or whatever it happens to be. One tool you really like? I guess we'll start with you, Ashley.
Do I get to go since I already said MBGrader? My other one is going to be Google Collaboratory, so that you can have students run stuff and have an active development environment without installing anything on their own computer. And Google Collaboratory has some significant advantages over some other things like Binder, but it has some disadvantages too. It's not really perfect yet, but I think Google is continually improving it. So I'm going to go with Google Collaboratory.
Let's just go alphabetical. How about you next, Emily?
I'm weird about R Markdown stuff, so I think the things that people post in Swirl and with R Markdown is not the best, I think, for necessarily grading what the students have written, but at least for check-ins for low stakes, like multiple choice or making sure that folks are on the same page, having some of that together has been really valuable.
Rachel,
RStudio server. Keeping everybody on the same page. Everybody's got a login. We don't have to install anything. Everything is installed, updated, and it's completely shared. So, and you can also run all of your bash code in there as well. So that's really nice to have everything. Like a lot of what I teach, I can just teach with RStudio server.
Same. RStudio server has been really good for us. And I'm also kind of intentionally not like designing my curriculum around any particular tool right now because I got burned by that a couple of years ago. I don't know, I had a really bad data camp experience. And I'm just like waiting for the field to figure out what is going to be free and well supported and good before I like dump a lot of my time designing my class around it.
And for me, since we don't have a server subscription, I would say RStudio Cloud, because it's the same reason. I can make sure I manage everybody else's instance of R, to make sure their environments are all the same. I can change those environments for every single assignment, and I can create individualized assignments, and then also check in on everybody's code at the same time. I can always peek in to see what they're doing. And also, I don't have to install anybody's crap either. That is the biggest time sucker. It's the worst. Make sure that the machinery, like they all have the same access to everything, whether or not they're on a Chromebook or they're on a super fancy Windows machine.
Just a reminder that RStudio Server Pro is free for teaching purposes. And we run it on a very tiny machine. I don't actually have to do the installs, but it would be pretty easy. So I think we run it on like a 4-core machine, and we run all of our intro bio students and a whole bunch of other students on it. So you don't need much to run it, and it's free.
All right, well, it's almost 3:30, which is about kind of when I had planned on sending us to breakouts, just kind of smaller targeted discussions. But before we do that, do any of our panelists or any of our participants have any sort of last comments before we move to breakouts?
I might circle back to there was this kind of general question about how to get other faculty on board if they don't have a lot of experience coding. And I also know that even people who are coding, we all have different levels of comfort. I definitely have had students in my classroom who are better at it than I am. Just like I've had students in my classroom who knew more about a particular subject like that I'm teaching, and that always happens. So I guess I like to de-emphasize the importance of that, saying like we're just using a tool together to accomplish an objective in a reproducible, efficient way. No one here is claiming to be like the best coder of all time. I don't know, trying to restructure the expectations there, I think has helped me a little bit.
Yeah, what Emily just said in the chat there, you know, the language of how we talk about this matters. You know, you're going to watch me make mistakes, like a lot. Any other kind of final comments from our panelists? Okay. So I figured what we could do for breakout rooms is, or what we did in the morning was I had each kind of panelists do their own breakout room, and just kind of, you know, in the Etherpad, which I just had the link to, maybe I still have it in my keyboard buffer, there it is. maybe towards the bottom, you could put your name and maybe a couple of things that you would be willing or able to talk about with a participant. And obviously, if you can't stay for breakouts, I know this is, everybody's Saturday. So if you can't stay for breakouts, you are certainly not obligated to. But for example, like Teague might put, using R in mammalogy as something that he was willing to talk about, or R in organismal biology or something like that. And then I'll just open breakout rooms. People can sort of self-assort into them. I'll remain in the main room in case anybody has any technical issues that they need to sort out. Does that sound all right to everyone? Cool. And I figure probably everyone can use a little break before breakouts. Some of you could say, like, people try to be in their breakout rooms by about 3:40. Does that sound all right? Cool. All right, so I will set up the breakout rooms with people's names. And yeah, we can take a little break, and then everyone can come back and do their discussions. I'll plan to leave the breakout rooms open till about 5 o'clock, which is about when I would like to drink a beer. So if your discussion ends before then, absolutely feel free to run off and enjoy your evening. If your discussion is going longer than 5 p.m., then that is unfortunate because I will end the meeting at 5 p.m. But basically anytime until then, we're welcome to do discussions. And if at any point you have to take off, whether you are a panelist or a participant, you are also welcome to do that. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to everyone else who showed up to help make this day happen. It's been really great, and hopefully we'll have some great discussions in these breakout rooms.